To the people of Houston, Andrea Whitfield was more than just a sheriff's deputy. She was a force to be reckoned with, a decorated officer, respected by her colleagues and feared by criminals. She had built a reputation for being ruthless on the streets and untouchable in the department. She wasn't just another cop. She was the kind that didn't need backup, the kind that criminals whispered about in hushed tones after feeling the cold steel of her handcuffs. Andrea had everything: respect, authority, and power. But power has a way of feeding itself, of growing insatiable. And for Andrea, power wasn't just something she wore on her badge. It was something she demanded in every aspect of her life, including in her marriage. Behind closed doors, Andrea was a different woman. She was not just dominant. She was controlling, obsessive, and unpredictable. She dictated every move, controlled every conversation, and left no room for defiance. And the one person who knew that better than anyone else was the man who had vowed to love her, Elijah Deo, a man who started as a rock, her balance, until he became her prisoner. They were the perfect couple in the eyes of the world. But inside their home, behind the locked doors and the carefully drawn curtains, Elijah was trapped. And soon, his name would be written in blood. Elijah wasn't the kind of man who looked for trouble. He was the opposite of Andrea in every way: calm, patient. A man who led with kindness rather than authority. Where Andrea saw the world in black and white, rules and consequences, Elijah saw shades of understanding, forgiveness, and compromise. He was a self-made man, a skilled contractor who built homes for others, but couldn't escape the house that had become his prison. When he met Andrea, he saw her confidence as something powerful, something rare. She was unlike anyone he had ever met, commanding, passionate, magnetic. He was drawn to her in ways he couldn't explain, captivated by the way she carried herself with unwavering certainty. She made him feel protected. But in time, he would realize there is a difference between being protected and being controlled. At first, the signs were small. A jealous streak here, a temper there. The first time she slapped him, he had laughed, confused more than hurt. They had been arguing over something trivial: where to eat, maybe what show to watch. The sting on his cheek faded quickly, especially when she pulled him close, whispered how much she loved him. "You know how I am, baby. I get so passionate." Elijah forgave her, until it happened again, and again, until the slaps became punches, until the bruises became a part of him, until he stopped recognizing the man in the mirror. Marriage vows are meant to be sacred, promises of love, loyalty, and devotion. But Elijah's vows had become a sentence. Andrea controlled everything. She dictated who he could talk to, where he could go, even what he could wear. If she didn't like a friend, they were gone. If he didn't answer her text quickly enough, she would bombard him with calls, demanding to know where he was, who he was with, what he was doing. And when she didn't get the answer she liked, she made him pay. At first, it was psychological. Cold shoulders, silent treatment, nights spent making him feel like he was the one who had done something wrong. Then came the intimidation. She didn't need to yell. She didn't even need to threaten him directly. All she had to do was remind him, "I'm a cop, Elijah. If I say you hit me, who do you think they'll believe?" And then the violence. Elijah started learning how to hide bruises, how to explain away sore ribs, how to smile through the pain. Because who would believe a man? A man claiming to be abused by his strong, powerful wife, a sheriff's deputy? The world wouldn't believe him. So he stayed silent. But Andrea's need for control didn't stop at their home. It spilled into everything. She had affairs, not just one, but many. Some were flings, others were power moves, manipulations. Many of them were with fellow officers, men she claimed to have no interest in, but entertained when she needed to assert dominance. Elijah suspected. He wasn't stupid. The late nights, the cold distance, the way she dismissed him when he asked questions. But it wasn't until he found the messages that he knew for sure. Explicit texts, photos, plans made in secrecy. She didn't even bother hiding it anymore. When he confronted her, she didn't deny it. She didn't apologize. She just laughed. "And what are you going to do about it?" That night, She hit him harder than she ever had before. And that was the night Elijah Dale made a decision. He wasn't going to live like this any longer. Late at night, while Andrea was asleep or at work, Elijah started documenting everything. He stood in the mirror, lifting his shirt, taking photos of the dark purple bruises that painted his ribs. He recorded her threats. "You think anyone would believe you over me? I'll ruin you, Elijah. Don't test me." He started a journal, detailing every incident, every slap, every punch, every warning, because one day he knew he would need proof. And then, with shaking hands and a racing heart, he walked into the Internal Affairs office and filed a report. It felt like the first step toward freedom. But Andrea had powerful friends. She had been in law enforcement long enough to know the game, to know how to make things disappear. And it didn't take long before she found out. A fellow officer, a close ally, one of her lovers. "Your husband went to IA. He reported you." The words hit like a gunshot. Her own husband, the man she fed, clothed, controlled, the man who was supposed to be hers, obedient, loyal, grateful. The rage came fast, hot, uncontrollable. But beneath it, something stronger. Humiliation. Because now, someone in the department might question her. She clenched her fists. Her jaw tightened. Her breath came fast and sharp. This wasn't just disobedience. This was betrayal. And betrayal had consequences. So she waited. She didn't call Elijah. She didn't text him. She gave no sign that she knew. She just waited, because soon he would walk through that door. And when he did, he would learn his final lesson. The air inside the house felt heavy. A kind of stillness that didn't belong. Elijah Dale had been on edge the entire drive home. His hands gripped the steering wheel too tightly, his pulse drumming beneath his skin. He knew the moment Andrea found out what he had done, she would come for him. But how much did she know? Had she seen the report? Had Internal Affairs already questioned her? Had her colleagues, her lovers, warned her? He exhaled sharply as he pulled into the driveway. The house was dark, too dark. Something was wrong. A cold instinctual fear crept up his spine. His fingers hovered over his phone, hesitating. Call someone. Tell someone where you are. Don't go inside. But then he shook his head. He was tired of being afraid. Tonight, he would confront her. Tell her it was over. That he wasn't going to be her prisoner anymore. The moment he pushed open the door, the air in the house felt thicker, suffocating. And then he saw her. Andrea. She was waiting in the dimly lit living room, sitting stiffly in a chair, her silhouette shadowed against the pale glow of the streetlights outside. She didn't move, didn't blink, just watched him, like a predator, like she had been waiting for him to walk into the trap. Then she spoke, her voice low, deliberate, dangerously calm. "You really thought you could do this to me?" Elijah set his keys down slowly, never breaking eye contact. "Andrea, we need to talk." Her laugh was short and sharp, humorless, almost mocking. "Talk? Oh, now you want to talk?" After you ran to Internal Affairs like a little BTCH. Asterisk. His stomach twisted. She knew. Of course she knew. But how much did she know? "I didn't run to them. I told them the truth." His voice was calm, steady. He had practiced this moment in his head 1,000 times. "Andrea, you can't keep doing this. You need help." The second the words left his mouth, he saw it, the shift in her eyes. Andrea didn't like losing control. And tonight, Elijah had dared to challenge her authority. The chair scraped against the floor as she stood up, slow, calculated, stepping toward him. "Help?" she whispered, tilting her head. "You think I need help?" Something glinted in her hand. A weapon? A knife? His heart pounded as he instinctively stepped back. Then she lunged, not with a weapon, but with her fists. Her first punch landed squarely against his jaw, snapping his head to the side. Hard. He barely had time to react before the second strike came, then a third. This wasn't rage. This was punishment. Years of unspoken rules between them shattered in that moment. Because this time, Elijah didn't take it. This time, he grabbed her wrists, stopping her. For the first time in their marriage, he fought back. "Stop." His voice was firm, steady. Andrea, enough. For a moment, she froze, as if something foreign had entered the space between them. Resistance. Something she wasn't used to. And that's when her hand moved to her sidearm. It happened too fast. 1 second. She was standing in front of him, breathing hard, her face twisted with fury. The next, the gun was in her hands, aimed directly at his chest. "You don't get to leave me, Elijah." His breath caught in his throat. She wasn't bluffing. She wasn't trying to scare him. She was going to pull the trigger. Elijah lifted his hands, slowly, stepping back. "Andrea, don't do this." Her finger twitched on the trigger. She wanted to kill him, needed to kill him, not just to punish him, but to erase him, to make sure no one would ever hear his story. And then, bang, pain exploded through his chest. He stumbled backward, his legs giving out. The floor rushed up to meet him, his hands pressed against the hot, spreading blood, his mind struggling to understand what had just happened. And then, bang, another shot, then another, then silence. Andrea didn't move at first. The smell of gunpowder still lingered in the air, mixing with the metallic tang of blood. Elijah's body lay sprawled across the floor, his breathing shallow, fading. And for the first time in her life, Andrea had lost control. But she wasn't going to let them see that. She inhaled sharply, gripping the gun tighter, and forced herself to think. She could still fix this, still control the narrative. She dialed 911, her voice trembling just enough to sound convincing. "My husband, he attacked me." Her breath hitched. I had no choice. She had practiced this 100 times before, coached women through domestic violence cases as an officer. Now, she would become the victim. By the time officers arrived, Andrea had crafted the perfect story. A terrified wife, a violent husband, a tragic but necessary act of self-defense. There was only one problem. The crime scene didn't match her story. The first officers on the scene noticed it immediately. Andrea was shaken, but unharmed. There were no defensive wounds on her, no bruises, no signs of a struggle. Elijah, however, he had been shot multiple times, his blood pooling around him, a trail leading toward the door, as if he had tried to get away. This wasn't self-defense. This was an execution. Then, Internal Affairs arrived, and with them, Elijah's report, photos of bruises, voice recordings, a journal tracking every beating, and the most damning piece of evidence? A text Elijah had sent his brother, just hours before his death. "If anything happens to me, you know who did it." Andrea Whitfield wasn't a victim. She was a murderer, and her time was running out. Andrea Whitfield had spent years hiding in plain sight. She had built a bulletproof reputation, a name that carried weight within the department. To her colleagues, she was the kind of officer you want at your side during a raid. Fearless, unshakable, reliable. To the community, she was a symbol of strength, a woman who had broken barriers in a male-dominated field. But now, standing in her own home, surrounded by fellow officers, her badge felt like nothing more than an empty piece of metal, because the truth was about to catch up with her. At first, the investigation seemed routine. Andrea was a cop, and cops protect their own. But then, Internal Affairs presented Elijah's report. Photos of bruises, recordings of threats in her own voice, a journal meticulously tracking each slap, punch, and warning. Then came the damning message. A text Elijah had sent his brother, Deo, just hours before his death. "If something happens to me, you know who did it." That single sentence changed everything. The victim had left breadcrumbs. And now, the trail led directly to Andrea. For the first time in her career, Andrea wasn't the one asking the questions. Now, she was a suspect, and the walls were closing in fast. At first, Andrea stuck to her story. She painted herself as a tragic wife, a woman forced to make an impossible choice. "He was violent. He attacked me first. I had no choice but to defend myself." But the evidence told a different story. The bullet trajectories revealed Elijah had been shot from a distance, not up close, not in self-defense. He had been trying to back away when the shots were fired. And then came the final piece of the puzzle. Elijah's brother, Zir, stepped forward. He handed over messages, texts, voice notes, emails, all proof that Elijah had been terrified of Andrea. He told him about the night before the murder, how Elijah had finally filed a report, how he had feared for his life. If she finds out, I don't know what she'll do. And now, Elijah was dead. It wasn't just murder. It was a premeditated execution. Andrea was running out of lies, and the truth was about to destroy her. When Andrea Whitfield was arrested, she still had the nerve to smile. Even as the cameras flashed, even as a headline screamed about the fall of a respected sheriff's deputy, she refused to show fear, because in her mind, she was still untouchable. But inside the courtroom, the truth was undeniable. The prosecution painted a chilling picture. A woman obsessed with power. A husband trapped in a prison of abuse. A last desperate attempt to escape. One that cost Elijah his life. The jury listened to Elijah's own voice, trembling in secret recordings. They saw the bruises, the desperate messages, the silent cries for help that had been ignored for far too long. The evidence was overwhelming. And in the end, justice spoke louder than Andrea's lies. Guilty. The courtroom fell silent. Andrea didn't flinch. She had spent her whole life in control. And now, she had no control at all. The judge handed down her sentence. 25 years to life. She would spend the rest of her days in the same system she once controlled. A prisoner. Just like Elijah had been. For Zir Deo, Elijah's brother, the verdict was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but his brother was still gone. And the hardest part? Elijah had tried to save himself. He had done everything right. He reported the abuse. He gathered evidence. He told the world his truth. And yet, no one listened until it was too late. Elijah wasn't the first man to suffer in silence. And he wouldn't be the last. Because the world still had a hard time believing that men could be victims too. That night, as Zir stared at the empty chair where his brother once sat, he made a silent promise. Elijah's story wouldn't be forgotten. Because for every voice that's silenced, there must be another that speaks. Andrea Whitfield had spent years convincing the world that she was a hero of her own story. But in the end, she had been the villain all along. The woman who thought she was above consequences. The officer who believed no one would ever question her. Now sat behind cold prison walls, stripped her badge, her power, and her control. And as the world moved on from the trial, as new headlines replaced her story, one question remained. How many other victims had suffered in silence, too afraid to fight back? And even worse, how many were still out there, waiting for someone to believe them?